Welcome to 'Tis the Soundtrack, the podcast dedicated to digging deep and bringing you the merriest of music all year long. I'm your host, Kevin Williams, and it's once again that magical day that marks the halfway point between last Christmas and the Christmas ahead, Leon Day. Leon Day is celebrated throughout the Christmas podcast community, and many shows have new episodes dropping today in honor of the holiday. We try to get into the fun each year ourselves. Last year, Jeff of the Lost Christmas podcast and I spent Leon Day creating Christmas playlists from the holiday music of the artists and bands of the 2025 Warped Tour. The year before that, and with the help of my daughter Eden, we did a deep dive on the Hafford Hardware television commercials and the amazing music of Andrea Von Campen that's featured in them. That happens to still be our most listened to episode 2 years later. This year, we're doing another deep dive for Leon Day. We're talking about a best-selling artist, a popular television personality, the head of A&R for 2 different record labels, someone who secretly fought against the racist attitudes of mid-century television networks and brands, someone whose hit-making formula led a record company to a decade of dominance, someone whose music was purportedly used as a weapon during a military siege, and someone whose refusal to embrace rock music could have ruined everything he built. This is the completely fascinating, often contentious, and eternally corny history of Mitch Miller and the gang.
Deck the hall with boughs of holly, fa la 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 la.
Miller was born in Rochester, New York in 1911. I won't spend a lot of time talking about his early years, since this episode is mainly focused on his time with Columbia Records and his time producing his sing-along albums and television show. The quick highlights are, as a teen, Miller was an oboe prodigy. He picked up the instrument by chance when, arriving late to a junior high tryout, it was one of the only free instruments left. By age 15, Miller was playing with the Syracuse Symphony, and, after high school, he attended the Eastman School of Music in Rochester. After graduating college, Miller moved to New York City and played in the orchestras of several famous conductors, including Andre Castellanets and Percy Faith. He toured with Gershwin, and when Porgy and Bess opened on Broadway in 1935, Miller was a member of the Pit Orchestra. During this time, he joined the CBS Symphony Orchestra and even performed as a member of it during Orson Welles' infamous War of the Worlds radio broadcast in 1938. In the 1940s, Miller signed with Mercury Records, initially as a classical music producer, but quickly rose to lead artists and repertoire for the label's pop music division. After a string of hits at Mercury, including Patti Page's massive country pop crossover Tennessee Waltz and Frankie Lane's whip-cracking Mule Train, Miller accepted the head A&R position at Columbia Records' pop division in 1950, a role offered to him by executive vice president and Miller's former Eastman classmate, Goddard Lieberson. Okay, now that we've rapidly covered Miller's first 39 years of existence, we're going to slow things down and dive into Mitch's time at Columbia. Miller arrived at Columbia at an interesting time. Columbia had just introduced the LP 2 years prior, and RCA Victor countered with the 45 a year later. By 1950, recording companies were rapidly moving their singles from 78s to 45s, and their 78 collections to single-disc LPs, or albums.
You would have to buy 6 records of any other type to get the same amount of music, but no other type recording brings you such magnificent sound. So when you buy, be sure and look for this LP on the album cover. That is the exclusive trademark of Columbia Records, and that's LP for long playing, lower price, lifelike performance. Columbia LP.
From the moment Miller took the reins at Columbia, he had the golden touch. His ear and his sensibilities largely defined the sound of pop music in the 1950s post-war, pre-rock and roll America, and his focus on the album as the delivery mechanism established Columbia as the leading pop music recording company. As the head of A&R, Miller not only signed artists, but selected songs, chose arrangements, and largely shaped the careers of many of the decade's biggest stars, including Tony Bennett, Johnny Mathis, Rosemary Clooney, Marty Robbins, and Jimmy Boyd. Tony Bennett was one of Miller's earliest signings at Columbia. Miller heard a demo 78 of Bennett singing Boulevard of Broken Dreams and, based on his raw vocal talent, offered him a contract. It was also Miller who convinced Bennett to record the ballad Because of You. Miller paired Bennett with Percy Faith, whom Miller had also brought to Columbia in his first year to serve as his musical director. With Bennett's voice and Faith's rich orchestral arrangement, the song shot to #1 on the charts and stayed there for 10 weeks. And after Johnny Mathis's first Columbia album failed to catch fire, It was Miller who stepped in and teamed him up with Columbia's in-house arranger, another recent Miller hire, Ray Conniff. Together, they created Mathis's breakout single, Wonderful, Wonderful, and established his signature sound.
It's wonderful, wonderful, oh, so wonderful, my love.
His album of the same name was released the following year and peaked at number 4 on the pop albums chart. There are many more examples of this, but they essentially all boil down to the same point. Miller knew how to make pop records. He had a formula, and he employed it again and again throughout his career. It started with Miller identifying amazing vocal talent and selecting songs that perfectly showcased it. He would then pair his singers with unorthodox instruments and snappy arrangements, meant to stand out and grab the listener's attention. He filled Columbia with extremely talented composers and arrangers who could execute on that vision, and maybe more than anyone else at the time, he knew the power of novelty. The signature whip cracking in Frankie Lane's Mule Train? That was Miller slamming together 2 wood flooring slats in front of a microphone. Miller not only pioneered many early studio effects, but used them to great commercial success. This included early vocal overdubbing, like the duet effect on Patti Page's Tennessee Waltz, as well as the sonic halo. This was Miller's term for the echo and reverb created by re-recording a vocal track that was played through a speaker inside a tiled room. Like a bathroom. He used a literal bathroom. He used this effect on many of the tracks he produced, a great example being Guy Mitchell's My Heart Cries for You, which made it all the way to number 2 on the pop chart in early 1951. Miller also had his own string of hits at Columbia, first with Zena 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 in 1950, which reached number 3 on the pop chart, and then again with his chart-topping The Yellow Rose of Texas in 1955. Miller heard a rework of The Yellow Rose by Don George, who had set the song to a marching beat. Starting there, Miller created his own arrangement, adding snare drums and changing some of the lyrics. Miller was so convinced the song would be a hit that he pressed 100,000 copies on the promise to personally buy back any that didn't sell. He never had to make good on his promise. The song held the number 1 spot for 6 weeks and went on to sell over 1 million copies.
There's a yellow rose in Texas that I am gonna see. Nobody else could miss her, not half as much as me.
Miller recorded 4 more of his own top 30 songs during the 1950s. By the end of the decade, Columbia Records was the top-selling recording company in the U.S. The Mitch Miller formula created some of the most memorable, the most commercially successful, and oftentimes the most cheesy pop records of the era. But that recipe for success also created friction with some artists. Vocalists were often seen as instruments, just another component used to create a Mitch Miller record. Artistic creativity took a back seat to commercial viability. For many newer artists, this was an easy trade-off. Mitch Miller and his hand-picked Columbia team refined their sound, launched their careers, and turned several of them into household names. But more established artists, and those hoping to use their Columbia contracts to forge their own paths, balked at being run through Miller's formulaic process, and bristled at being used to create novelty tracks. A young Aretha Franklin was signed to Columbia under Miller's leadership, but boxed into traditional jazz and pop standards. It wasn't until she moved to Atlantic Records in 1966 that she found her true R&B voice. And when Rosemary Clooney initially refused to record Come On to My House, calling it a cheap, insulting caricature of Armenian folk music, Miller purportedly threatened to fire her from Columbia and ruin her career. But even that paled in comparison to Sinatra's grudge against Miller. Sinatra, who had been with Columbia for 7 years when Miller took over, was already suffering from changing tastes in music and slumping record sales. Miller convinced him to record Mama Will Bark, a duet with actress Dagmar that also featured dog impersonator Donald Bain providing a barking effect.
Your eyes are shining like the starlight.
Yes, but Mama will bark.
Your lips are so inviting, darling. Give me one more kiss.
Despite being hated by Sinatra, the song was a hit, peaking at 21 on the pop chart. But it was also seen as a further fall. It was an early indicator that the first act of Sinatra's career was coming to an end. I say first act because after Mama Will Bark and Sinatra's growing animosity with Miller, Columbia chose not to renew his contract. Broke and labeled as a has-been, Sinatra moved to Hollywood in 1952, signed with Capitol Records, and orchestrated what is still viewed as one of the greatest musical comebacks in history. But that's a different story for a much different podcast. Conflicts aside, Miller continued to helm Columbia's pop division until 1965. And during his 15-year run, Miller and Columbia were responsible for some of the most iconic Christmas music of the era. It took a while, but we got there. And as it turns out, Christmas music is one of the places where Miller's influence can be most easily heard to this day. Miller personally produced the Jimmy Boyd hit I Saw Mommy Kissing Santa Claus in 1952.
I saw Mommy kissing Santa Claus.
And though Gene Autry was signed to Columbia as a country western act, it was Miller's pop prowess that pushed both Frosty the Snowman and Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer to crossover success, each selling millions. When Rosemary Clooney's Columbia contract prevented her from performing on the official White Christmas soundtrack, Miller personally oversaw production of Clooney's own White Christmas album for Columbia. With orchestral arrangements by Percy Faith and Paul Weston, and several songs reworked to be sung as solos, Rosemary Clooney and songs from the Paramount Pictures production of Irving Berlin's White Christmas was released in 1954.
Snow, it won't be long before we'll all be there with snow.
In addition to that mouthful of a title, Percy Faith also released his own Christmas album, Music of Christmas, the same year. And in 1958, it was Percy Faith and his orchestra backing Johnny Mathis on the classic album Merry Christmas, a hugely successful album that continues to be one of the top 5 selling Christmas albums of all time.
Sleigh bells ring, are you listening? In the lane, snow is glistening.
Miller's in-house arranger Ray Conniff also contributed a pair of his own Christmas albums, Christmas with Conniff in 1959 and We Wish You a Merry Christmas in 1962. As did another past Miller collaborator, Andre Castellanetz with Joy to the World in 1959 and Wonderland of Christmas in 1963. Miller also produced Frank DeVol's Old Sweet Songs series, including one of my personal favorite Christmas albums of the era, Frank DeVol and His Rainbow Strings, The Old Sweet Songs of Christmas. Released in 1960, it was the third album in the Old Sweet Songs series, all released in a single year. A few other seminal Christmas albums that were released in the last few years of Miller's tenure include Merry Christmas by the folk ensemble group The New Christy Minstrels, the Doris Day Christmas album, Patti Page's Christmas with Patti Page, Johnny Cash's The Christmas Spirit, and a pair of timeless albums from Andy Williams, 1963's The Andy Williams Christmas Album, which debuted the song It's the Most Wonderful Time of the Year, and 1965's Merry Christmas, featuring his classic version of Do You Hear What I Hear?
Do you hear what I hear? What I hear? What I hear?
Said the night wind to the little lamb.
And we can't not mention the Goodyear Tire's Great Songs of Christmas series. Columbia Special Products started producing the holiday compilation series in 1961, which was sold at Goodyear stores throughout the country for just $1, a way to drive foot traffic into the stores during the winter months. Goodyear and Columbia initially pressed 30,000 copies of the 1961 album, assuming that would be plenty to meet customer demand. That first album went on to sell over 900,000 copies. For the following year, Columbia upped production to 1.5 million, and that number climbed to 2 million by 1963. The Great Songs series sold an estimated 15 million albums in the first 5 years, and 35 to 40 million albums over its entire 17-year run. Miller wasn't directly involved in the Great Songs series. It was instead managed by Columbia Special Products' B2B division, but the albums, especially the early ones, were packed full of Christmas songs produced during Miller's run. Andy Williams, Percy Faith, Andre Castellanetz, the New Christy Minstrels, Frank DeVol, and Doris Day all appeared on the early 1960s albums. Miller also appeared on several of the early albums himself, with his male vocal choir, The Gang, performing What Child Is This?, It Came Upon a Midnight Clear, Away in a Manger, The First Noel, and Coventry Carol. And this takes us to the next part of our story, Mitch Miller and The Gang. The Gang was an evolution of the male studio session singers that Miller hired to add a large-scale choral element to his early Columbia recordings. In 1958, Miller launched his Sing-Along series, a series of albums centered around a massive, booming male chorus that at the same time also sounded like an army of ordinary guys singing. For each sing-along album, Miller employed around 24 singers. Then, using the overdubbing techniques he developed and running the vocal tracks through an echo chamber he built in Columbia's basement, he was able to give the records a larger-than-life sound, like the songs were being performed by a full 100-man choir. Miller's sing-along series had another gimmick as well. Each album came with a set of tear-out lyric sheets, so listeners could in fact sing along with Mitch and the gang. Miller released 2 Christmas albums as part of his series: Mitch Miller and the Gang's Christmas Sing-Along with Mitch in 1958 and Holiday Sing-Along with Mitch in 1961. And I cannot stress enough how unique and how ridiculously popular Miller's sing-along albums were at the time. Miller understood that Columbia's LP format meant you could now sell an experience, not just a collection of songs. The sing-along series was marketed as family entertainment, and consumers ate it up. His first album in the series, 1958's Sing-Along with Mitch Miller and the Gang, spent 8 weeks at the top of the popular albums chart and remained on the chart for 128 weeks in total. That's almost 2.5 years. Miller repeated this success with his follow-up album, Christmas Sing-Along with Mitch, later the same year. That album, which featured 13 traditional and religious carols, including all 5 that I mentioned from the Goodyear series, spent 2 weeks at the top of the pop albums chart. Again, these albums sold insanely well. There was a week in late 1958 when 3 of Miller's sing-along albums, including his Christmas sing-along, held the top 3 spots on the pop albums chart. Miller's second Christmas album, 1961's Holiday Sing-Along with Mitch, was the opposite side of the coin. Like the first, it also contained 13 Christmas songs, but instead of traditional carols and hymns, it was full of contemporary hits like the aforementioned Frosty, Rudolph, and I Saw Mommy Kissing Santa Claus.
I saw Mommy kissing Santa Claus.
Holiday Sing-Along took its own turn in the number 1 spot on the pop albums chart for a week in December 1961 and stayed on the chart for a total of 13 weeks. Miller recorded a total of 19 sing-along albums for Columbia in just 5 years, from 1958 through 1962. Combined, those albums sold more than 22 million copies, making Miller, arguably, the most successful album artist at the time. Let's think about that for a second. For nearly a decade, one of the best-selling series of albums in the world was from a goofy-looking guy with a goatee performing sing-along songs. Not Elvis, not the Beatles, Mitch Miller. The success of the series also gave Miller momentum to create the Sing Along with Mitch television show, which ran on NBC for 4 years. Following the same format as his albums, and, if we're being honest, acting as an hour-long commercial for them, each episode of the show featured Miller and the gang performing songs around a central theme. It could be the Old West, or Dixieland, or even Winter Wonderland. Yes, there were Christmas episodes, and we'll get to that in a minute. Each episode started with Miller staring into the camera and saying,
Please, don't just sit there. Come on and sing.
5 foot 2, eyes of blue. Oh, what those 5 foot.
I'm going to pause here for a second because there are several things we need to unpack about the sing-along opening. First, people remember the show having a bouncing ball that followed the words. It did not. This is a classic example of the Mandela effect and is likely caused by people confusing the show with other sing-alongs. Max Fleischer invented the bouncing ball for his Coco Song cartoons animated shorts. The technique was also used in a handful of Paramount's Novel Tunes episodes, from the mid-40s to the mid-50s. Paramount also revived it for the Novel Tunes episode Hobo's Holiday in 1963, specifically to cash in on the popularity of Sing Along with Mitch. Next, we have to talk about Miller's incredibly bizarre conducting style. Each episode would start with a close-up shot of Miller facing the camera and conducting to the audience at home while the choir performed behind him. And, instead of typical conducting movements, Miller would keep his arms close to his sides and make stiff chopping motions with his hands. And if you've never seen it, that description probably doesn't do it justice, so I'll throw a link in the show notes to a video where you can see it in all its glory. There's a lot of information online stating that Miller never learned how to properly conduct. So, instead he just chopped his hands to the beat like a metronome. That is not the case. In an interview, Miller explained that the odd conducting style was a result of how the show was filmed. During early filming, he was asked repeatedly to bring his arms in closer to his body so they would fit in the frame for the close-up head-on shots. After several attempts to reduce his movements, Miller eventually just tucked his arms in and began conducting in the rigid chopping style that became a hallmark of the show. That story was also confirmed by Bob McGrath. Yes, the same Bob McGrath that played Bob Johnson, the music teacher on Sesame Street, for over 45 years. He was an original member of the television gang in 1961, as well as a frequent soloist on the show.
And now, Miller's Monumental Minstrels proudly present
the glorious golden voice of Mr. Robert Emmett McGrath.
Darling, I am growing old.
In a Television Academy interview, Bob not only recalled the story of the odd conducting style, but also shared that during rehearsal, Miller conducted in a completely normal fashion, and that by the time the episode was filmed, the gang had the songs down and didn't need to follow Mitch, who was facing the opposite direction anyway. It was another gimmick for the audience. And speaking of the gang, just like the vocalists featured on the sing-along albums, Miller hand-selected each member of the television gang for their specific vocal qualities. The result was 24 men, some younger, some older, some thinner, some not, glasses and bald spots scattered throughout, a typical bunch of dads, a reflection of the audience watching at home. There's also a bunch of information floating around the internet about how Miller salted the gang, how he cherry-picked extremely talented vocalists from New York studios, Broadway shows, and operas, how he dressed them like dorky dads so they wouldn't stand out. That is sort of true. The gang didn't need to be salted. It was composed entirely of talented vocalists, many of which had already performed on recordings, or with choirs, on stages, or in TV jingles. As for looks, I think Miller put it best when he said, if a guy's bald, or if he's fat, that's the way he'll appear on the show. I think that the audience likes it that way. This did cause some frustration for the show's advertisers and sponsors. They requested that the performers be replaced with the same square-jawed, athletic Hollywood Adonises that were used in other variety shows. Miller stood his ground, pushing back that he hired for talent, not looks, and that his audience, which he knew extremely well, would find the gang more relatable if they looked like their neighbors, not a sterile, hyper-polished dance troupe. Miller also faced advertiser and network pushback for his decision to regularly feature guest singer Leslie Uggams, who younger viewers might know from her role as Blind Al in the Deadpool films.
I pray every day that fire finds your body and finishes the job God didn't have the nuts to do.
That's hurtful. If you could hear the look on my face, you'd smell how sad.
Uggams was one of the first black women to be featured regularly on a nationally broadcast network variety show. Over worry of losing Southern markets, Miller was asked to remove Uggams. Miller, again, stood his ground. Pushback continued, with the network offering other solutions. And since this is a podcast, let me note that's solutions, surrounded by large, sarcastic finger quotes. They asked Miller to move Uggams to her own segments, so they could be cut out of the broadcast in the South, similar to how Lena Horne's movie scenes were often filmed separate, so they could be cut from the theatrical showings in the region. Miller refused. They countered, asking that Uggams be positioned on the edge of the scene, away from the other performers, so she could be cropped out of the show. Again, Miller refused. When it became clear they could not have Uggams removed entirely, Miller was then asked to make sure that none of the white singers touched or danced with her, feeling it would be offensive to their Southern viewers. Once again, Miller refused, saying that the show is a family, and if Uggams is not prominently featured, front and center, he'd pull the entire show off NBC. Miller successfully resisted the pressure, and his show was broadcast nationwide without edits, even in the South. In an interview with the Archive of American Television, Leslie Uggams shared that she didn't know anything about the fight happening behind the scenes until years after the show ended its run. Miller kept it to himself, not wanting it to affect her or influence her performance. She also shared that when the show began airing in the South, Southern folks were so nosy that they tuned in to see what the show was about, and that some of her best fan mail came from viewers in the region. I'll link to the full interview in the show notes. The Sing Along with Mitch show ran from 1961 through 1964. In addition to the gang and the regular singers like Uggams, Diana Trask, and Mary Lou Ryhall, Sing Along also featured guest stars like Shirley Temple, George Burns, and Milton Berle, as well as mystery celebrities who would show up for the closing song. Over the show's 4-year run, mystery guests included Johnny Carson, Buddy Hackett, and Jerry Lewis, among many others. The show also featured a holiday episode each year. The first holiday show, in 1961, was used to heavily promote Miller's second Christmas album, Holiday Sing Along with Mitch. And watching from a 2026 lens, I can best describe the episode as a bizarre fever dream. It starts with Miller inviting a group of children on a flying visit to some different kinds of Christmas. He shows them a sleigh, explaining that it's old, but it's in great shape, and that the last owner was a white-bearded gentleman who only drove it one night a year. He also explains that it runs on wishes, a 30-wish-power sleigh to be precise, and it requires 30 real, sincere wishes to make the sleigh take off. Miller and the kids hop in, while the gang helps them get airborne by singing Santa Claus is Comin' to Town. Apparently the sleigh can also travel through time, since their first stop is Victorian England, where they watch carolers sing a medley of God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen, Deck the Halls, and 12 Days of Christmas.
God rest ye merry gentlemen, let nothing you dismay. Remember Christ our Savior was born on Christmas Day to save us all from Satan's power when we were gone astray. Oh, tidings of comfort and joy, comfort and joy. Oh, tidings of comfort and joy.
After their first stop, it's back to present time, where they peek in on sing-along regular Diana Trask, who performs the Christmas song while decorating her tree.
Chestnuts roasting on an open fire, Jack Frost nipping at your nose.
Next, Miller reminds the kids that many of their fathers were in the army, and that sometimes soldiers spend Christmas in some not very Christmassy places. He and the kids wish themselves a few years back in time so they can observe soldiers in a desert camp singing a medley of White Christmas and It Came Upon a Midnight Clear, while they build their own makeshift Charlie Brown-esque tree and pass around a box of cookies. And since they were already flying over the desert, they make another stop, as Miller puts it, only a few miles away, but back a long, long way in time. The next number is the Three Wise Men singing We Three Kings and O Little Town of Bethlehem.
We three kings of Orient are, bearing gifts we traverse afar.
Miller and the kids then wish themselves back to the studio, where the gang is waiting to sing Rudolph and Sleigh Ride, while a 2-person horse-style costume of a giant white reindeer with a red nose dances around them.
Rudolph the red-nosed reindeer had a very shiny nose.
This is followed by Leslie Uggams performing Mary's Boy Child,
Long time ago in Bethlehem, so the Holy Bible say, Mary's boy child Jesus Christ was born on Christmas Day.
Back in the sleigh, the kids take things into their own hands and wish Miller into Santa Claus, his signature black goatee transforming into a long white beard. And we wrap up back in the studio with Miller once again doing his odd conducting while the gang sings The First Noel, Hark the Herald Angels Sing, and Jingle Bells, before bringing in all the featured singers, the dancers, and the kids to end with a sing-along of Silent Night. It was bizarre, it was goofy, it was corny, family Christmas fun. Exactly what Miller wanted it to be. There were 2 more Christmas specials in 62 and 63, themed around a 19th century old-fashioned Christmas and Christmas around the world, respectively, but the first one, with the time-traveling wish-powered sleigh, is the most bonkers one and my favorite. There wasn't a Christmas special for 1964 because, due to slipping ratings, NBC chose not to renew the show for another season. America's taste in music was rapidly changing. Miller's core audience was people over 40, people who were largely becoming irrelevant as companies and brands started targeting younger consumers, that demographic now called the baby boomers. And the same story was playing out over at Columbia. Miller's refusal to sign rock artists was allowing competitors to chip away at Columbia's dominance over pop music. He chose not to pursue Elvis's contract, allowing RCA to acquire it from Sun Records, and he outright rejected Buddy Holly after listening to a demo of That'll Be the Day. The reason for Miller's refusal to sign rock artists has changed over the years. During interviews he gave late in life, he blamed his disdain on rock for payola. Payola was a practice in the 50s and 60s of record labels secretly paying DJs to play specific songs, boosting their popularity. This culminated in a congressional investigation in 1959 and an amendment to the Federal Communications Act making pay-to-play a crime. Prior to that, Miller had blamed rock, specifically the British invasion, for stealing black American music and repackaging it so it would appeal to a white audience. Both of those reasons seem reasonable, possibly virtuous, but I think the real answer is that he just didn't understand it. He thought it was amateurish, a fad, and it didn't fit his tried-and-true formula for making pop hits. All the way back in 1958, Miller gave what I believe was his real reason for hating rock music. This came during a keynote speech he gave at a disc jockey convention. He attacked DJs for playing rock music. He called it trash, juvenile delinquency set to music. His speech was not received well. Radio stations increasingly ignored his traditional pop releases in favor of rock and roll. For their part, Columbia continued to back Miller's direction until 1965. Again, Miller had turned Columbia into the most dominant pop label in the early 50s and the highest-selling pop album label in the early 60s. But that dominance was already fading by 1965. Rock music, especially after the British invasion, was taking over airwaves and the record store shelves. Labels were scrambling to sign the next Beach Boys, the next Rolling Stones, the next Beatles. All of them except Columbia. CBS, Columbia's parent company, was growing more and more concerned that missed opportunities to their rivals, like Capitol who signed the Beatles, and RCA who bought Elvis's contract from Sun, were going to render their label irrelevant and cost it millions of dollars in future revenue. Competitors were packing their labels with young, talented acts, while Miller was still focused on producing traditional pop albums by aging artists for aging listeners. CBS began viewing Miller as a liability, one that would sink Columbia if he was left in charge. After Miller stepped down in 1965, Columbia did a complete 180, going all in on the few rock and roll acts their West Coast division had managed to sign around Miller in the early 60s. They heavily promoted Bob Dylan, whose early acoustic albums on Columbia had actually performed poorly, the Byrds, and Paul Revere and the Raiders. The transformation was complete when Clive Davis, who coincidentally passed away the week this episode was recorded, took control of Columbia in 1967. Starting with his first signing of Janis Joplin and Big Brother and the Holding Company at the '67 Monterey International Pop Festival, Davis spent his first 5 years filling Columbia with high-caliber rock acts like Chicago, Sly and the Family Stone, the Chambers Brothers, Earth, Wind and Fire, Bruce Springsteen, and Aerosmith. Fun fact, Pink Floyd recorded the orchestral arrangements and the choral backing tracks for The Wall, including the children's choir featured on Another Brick in the Wall Part 2, using the echo chamber Miller built in Columbia's New York studio basement, the same echo chamber he used to process the vocals for his sing-along albums. As for Miller, he went on to have his own second act after Columbia. I won't spend a lot of time on it since it wasn't our main focus, but a few things to note. He became a consultant for MCA Records and used his pop music expertise to guide and shepherd the legacy catalog and traditional pop releases for their Decca Records subsidiary. He also became a highly respected symphony conductor. He was a frequent and beloved guest conductor for the Boston Pops Orchestra, and he traveled the world conducting regional symphonies and earning critical acclaim for his interpretations of the works of his old friend, George Gershwin. For decades, he would lead large crowds in live community sing-alongs at events all around the country. And he returned to television, first in 1981 for a special sing-along gang reunion on NBC, then later with PBS specials like Keep America Singing in 1994 and Voices in Harmony in 1996. In 2000, at the age of 89, Miller was awarded the Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award for his revolutionary studio work. And that's about it. Oh, wait, I almost forgot. There was also that time his music was used as a weapon. During the 1993 standoff with David Koresh and his Branch Davidian cult in Waco, Texas, the FBI set up massive, high-powered loudspeakers to cause sleep deprivation and attempt to break the resolve of the cult members. FBI agents played a bizarre, deafening loop of audio that purportedly included Tibetan Buddhist chants, screaming rabbits, cavalry bugles blaring Reveille, Nancy Sinatra's These Boots Were Made for Walking, and Christmas songs from the Mitch Miller and the Gang Sing Along with Mitch albums. Supposedly, Miller's Christmas songs were chosen for their hyper-cheerfulness and fast pace. You have to remember that adults in the 90s were the same kids rebelling against traditional pop music in the 60s. So, by 1993, Miller's music was generally considered incredibly corny, grating, and irritating. The thought was that blasting upbeat, happy Christmas music at an ear-splitting volume would be disorienting and unsettling to Koresh, who viewed himself as both a rock musician and a messianic figure. The tactic ultimately failed, and Koresh used giant speakers of his own to blast rock music back at the federal agents. But that story does showcase how the view of Miller and his music changed over the decades, from best-selling pop artist to corny, grating, and irritating, at least for many of those who watched the show as children or had to endure their parents playing the albums. Mitch Miller exemplified what they spent their teenage years trying to distance themselves from. Miller was the anti-Zeppelin, and that's why a good deal of those 22 million records found their way to donation centers and thrift stores rather than passed down as cherished family heirlooms. I've heard that when a record store buys a collection, the first thing they do is toss all the Mitch Miller albums directly in the trash. I don't know if that's true, or just a reflection of how many Mitch Miller albums are out in circulation. Personally, I'm not sure I've ever flipped through the record bins at a thrift store without finding at least one Sing Along with Mitch album. Actually, the same can be said for the self-titled Blood, Sweat, and Tears album. It seems to be everywhere, and I'm not really sure what that's all about. Although, Blood, Sweat, and Tears is another example of an early Clive Davis Columbia signing, so I suppose there's that connection. And now, almost 70 years since the first sing-along album, since the variety show, since the whole phenomenon, I think we've come full circle. There are now multiple generations who have no context for Mitch Miller or the music he created. For those who do remember him, he is now firmly part of mid-century American nostalgia. Or for folks under 60, maybe it's more anemoia, the nostalgia for a time and place you've never experienced. As someone in that sub-60 demographic myself, that's how I feel when I spin my Sing-Along with Mitch Christmas albums. Both of them rescues from thrift store dollar bins. And I think that's a good place to wrap things up. I hope you all have a very Merry Leon Day, and be sure to check out some of the other great shows in the Christmas Podcast Network and their special Leon Day episodes. Thank you for listening to 'Tis the Soundtrack. You can find all of our past episodes on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. We don't judge, but we'd sure appreciate a like or subscribe while you're there. You can also find us on Instagram, Threads, and Blue Sky, all under the handle @TisTheSoundtrack. Our website is tisthesoundtrack.com, and you can get in touch with us via email at kevin@tisthesoundtrack.com. Our intro music is Krampus Workshop by that wizard of most everything audio, Kevin MacLeod. You can find him and his work at incompetech.com. All other music, songs, and snippets of audio used throughout this episode belong to their respective copyright holders and are used solely for the purpose of commentary. Links to all the music featured in this episode are available in the show notes or episode description for you folks on YouTube. Cheers, and happy Leon Day.